Okay, let's have a look at the 7 churches, or the letters to the 7 churches, because we've just found out that there are 7 churches. We're about to see the messages that were sent to each of these churches. And each message would have been read out. So there's a specific message that heads to each church. They're named and it's very specific to them. But the way that this letter from John would have been delivered, there would have been a messenger who took it around. And each of the churches would have copied down the bits that were relevant for them. And probably they would have copied down the whole lot because the whole lot was relevant for them. Really, you've got each of the churches would have seen the messages to all the other churches. And they all would have known each other to some extent as well, because the leaders would have made the trek to catch up with their church leadership in Ephesus. Like they would have come across John before. He would have travelled to these churches, and we're talking about people who know each other. Yeah, it's kind of like talking about for the Warren Ponds people, it's talking about out to Bannockburn. Yeah. You kind of know them. Mm. Yeah, and you would recognise them if you saw them in the street, and if there was a message to them, you'd be interested in what God had to say to them as well as what God had to say to you. What's interesting about these letters is that they all follow the same pattern. And the pattern has 7 different elements to it. Now, there are a couple that miss bits and pieces. So they all contain like a commission. They all contain like a reference to the character of the church, something that they do well, something that's good about them. They all contain the commendation, like, hey, good job. They all contain a condemnation or a rebuke. You're not doing this so well. Like, good job on this, but hey, you've missed something else. They contain a correction, what they need to do differently. They all contain a call, and they all contain a challenge. So it's like a standard, like a template almost, that we see used again and again and again. Now, some of the churches don't have some of the bits, but we're talking about 3 exceptions out of 7 times 7. Right? So it's quite noticeable when they're missing a section. Laodicea doesn't have a commendation. The Laodicean church not doing much well. There's nothing, but Jesus says, hey, good job for this. And there's no condemnation for Smyrna or Philadelphia. Just about every pastor on the planet would love to think that their church fits the Philadelphia example. The reality is probably not any of them do. It's probably wishful thinking rather than anything else. Now, what's staggering to me is when you look at the names of these 7 churches. So before I say that, there are 7 churches. The number 7 represents perfection or completion. So by talking about 7 churches, we're not just talking about a collection of churches, the number of which equals 7. We're talking about the complete church. These churches are representative of the global church, both in the time, the literal time that this letter was written to these 7 churches, but also, and it blows my mind that God had pre-arranged this, because the 7 churches, the letters are in order that a messenger would go if they were going to do a round trip. Right, so it's not like they have to go backwards and forwards in terms of their order. But the names of these towns line up absolutely perfectly with these 7 periods of church history. Absolutely staggering. And then you look at the issues in each of these churches and the things that they're doing well and the things they're doing not so well, they also line up perfectly with these 7 periods of church history. Absolutely amazing. Can you imagine? Like the odds of this happening is just like unprecedented. That these 7 messages have these layers of application.
God's in control.
Well, totally, but even that, like, there's a fair bit of forethought that's gone into that. Like, these towns weren't named by God. These were largely pagan cities that the churches moved into. Like,
prophecy on steroids.
It is absolutely crazy. All right, let's get back onto Revelation. So, layers of application. We've got the literal application of these letters to these churches. So these were 7 letters written by a guy who lived in AD 90 to people who were living in 7 different churches who were physical churches in what is now Turkey, talking about their unique context and circumstance. So it's a letter to people in that time period. There's also the historical application I was talking about. So the fact that the names of these places and the messages line up beautifully with the blind spots of churches or church periods throughout the church age. So we can look at it and we can go, okay, the letter to Ephesus lines up with the Apostolic Church. The letter to Smyrna lines up with persecuted church. The letter to Pergamum lines up with the state church under Constantine. The letter to Thyatira, which we've already had some teaching on, lines up with Catholicism and the rise of the Catholic Church. The letter to Sardis lines up with the Reformation churches. So we're talking Calvinist and Lutheran churches and the early Reformed churches. And then we've got the letter to Philadelphia, lines up with the missionary and revival churches. And then the message to Laodicea it's the apostate church, which is from the 1900s to whenever we get raptured. Those time periods match up beautifully, and the names match up beautifully when you look at the meanings of the place. The word Ephesus would be the word in Greek that a man would use to refer to his bride, the maiden he'd chosen to marry. So it lines up beautifully with the apostolic church, who is the bride of Christ. We're all the bride, but they were the ones that he had his marriage covenant with. Now, the next layer is basically looking at churches that originated in those time periods, because the Catholic Church is still doing the Catholic Church's thing, like they were all the way back. The Lutheran and Calvinist churches are all essentially doing the same thing that they were doing way back then. The Pentecostal Church is doing the same thing.
Why are there two distinctions between the Catholic Church and the Calvinist and Lutheran that you've just mentioned?
Yep.
Because aren't they both a works-based salvation?
So basically the distinction's drawn at the time of Martin Luther. So when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door at Whitney, there was a really big distinction, and that was when the Protestant churches basically broke off. So the Protestant churches, essentially they were started by Catholics, because everyone was Catholics.
Yeah.
But they had a very different way of interpreting their Bible and a different availability of Bible. So they do hold similar views. I mean, you could argue that the Anglican Church probably fits in one of those categories as well, rather than in a more Pentecostal space, because essentially it's a rebranded Catholic Church, with very similar beliefs and traditions. Okay, so most people will stop there at the churches and go, yes.
And you said that from the 1900s on, we're the apostate church.
So that also applies. So the churches are originating out of these time periods. So these blind spots apply to those churches.
Oh, I see. Not the whole period that it happened.
Yeah, so the way I like to look at this is that the messages highlight blind spots. These are the things that, hey, you're doing really well at this stuff, but because you're doing really well at this stuff, you've accidentally, you don't know you're missing some of these other aspects. All right? Churches that have revival focus do have they've got blind spots, and that's what these messages are intended to point out. The fact that we're in a church and we're post 1900 means that we are in the apostate church as well. So you can have a church that's got blind spots associated to its roots, where that denomination has come from, but it's also going to have blind spots based on the time period in which it operates. And then we get to the next level, which is each one of us has been influenced by a bunch of people who have been influenced by a bunch of these different traditions.
Yeah.
So if you've got a pastor who's ministering in a revival church, who's come out of a reformed church, he's going to carry views from his upbringing.
Contrary to what
Potentially. So what this is saying is, these blind spots, we need to read more than just, we think this one applies to us. We need to be looking at all of them, going, what are the influences that I've been under that are unique to each of us? I was saved into an Anglican church, and we've been part of Churches of Christ, we've been part of apostolic churches, we've been part of, we've been part of CRC, we've been part of lots of different ones. So what are those influences? What blind spots do I have because of those influences? And all it's saying is, let's get a list, because there are rewards.
Good influence as well, don't you?
Well, it's kind of nice to have this as our influence, right? The Bible is we need that to be our line in the sand. This is where we go back to. But we need to be aware that we have that influence, and we're going to have blind spots, and we need to fix them. The whole take the log out of your eye before you try and fix somebody else's blind spots.
If pastors are not reading and doing their stuff out of the Bible, well, it's that too. Question.
Yep. So if you've got people who are teaching and people who are leading who are not aware of these things, they're going to push down a path. Yeah. Same with the denomination. They're going to push you down a path, and they're going to have gaps.
Yeah.
Let's sort out the gaps. That's what these messages are about. So does that make sense? So we're going to go through and we're going to look at each one of the messages. I want you to be thinking, does this message apply to me? They all will to some degree, but some will apply more than others. And the whole point of this is, as we're going through, is for you to be saying, well, hang on, what do I need to do in response to this? Jesus tells you exactly what you need to correct. Which ones of those do I need to apply so that I'm addressing my blind spots?
This is for personally as well as church.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, your church has not got anything to do with your salvation. That's about you and the action you take in response to what you learned. Yeah? And no one's going to be able to go, but Jesus, I went to church.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank God I went to the right church.
Yeah.
Like,
I didn't tithe, I didn't
Yeah,
do
that's
this, I
right.
didn't do that, but I went to church.
Yeah.
I don't.
this is more than just, let's have a read of what some bloke wrote to a bunch of churches 2,000 years ago. All right, this has personal application to us right now. All right, let's have a look at Ephesus, or the letter to the message to the church at Ephesus. So this is Revelation chapter 2, and we're going to read verse 1 to verse 11. We have a volunteer. Does somebody want to read for us? Revelation chapter 2 up to verse 11.
To the angel of the church of Ephesus,